I don't remember how many of these events we've had, but twice a year we have a symposium to show the works of the Earth Institute postdoctoral fellows, both those who have recently been admitted to the program and those who have been here a while and have been doing research in the program. This fellows program was introduced into the Earth Institute essentially in the first year of the Institute, or at least in the Institute under Jeff Sachs's direction. It's one of the things that Jeff required as a condition of coming to Columbia, that he would have a postdoc fellows program. And people in the budget office at the Earth Institute never fail to tell me how much they allocate for this. And so our response is to show them how well their money is spent. So part of the purpose of this is to show you what the fellows are doing, to engage your comments, and to then have a little get-together to meet one another. So I'm very pleased to get the ball rolling. I don't know if one of the fellows is going to help, but the first speaker, or what we'll do, is have a first group of speakers followed by questions at the end, rather than have questions for each of the speakers individually. So we'll run through this first group in session one, then we'll have a question session, a little break, and then go to the next one, by which time I'm sure Jeff will be here. He's coming. I don't have to substitute for him all afternoon. So, okay, so let's begin with Andrew Bell, who'll lead us off. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Good crowd today. Does anybody know how to get it to go full screen? F5. Oh, F5? Oh, sorry. I went the F5 route. Uh-oh. I'm sorry. So just while I'm getting us started, my name's Andrew Bell. I'm a second-year fellow, and someone said Control L. Sorry, I'm a Mac person.
Toolbar on the far right, that square with two arrows. Left.
Oh, okay, perfect. So I'm attached to the Turing Lab at LDEO. The last couple of Earth Institute forums I've been here, I've been talking about applying paleoclimate data to risk management in agriculture. And that's going great. We've got this application to index insurance we're really excited about. But today I wanted to talk about something a little bit newer, a little bit sort of earlier in development that I'm working with, which is looking at the boom-bust hypothesis of development in the Amazon in Brazil. So, okay, that showed up pretty well. There on the right is a map of Brazil. The darker green area that I'm showing is the set of legal Amazon states, and that sort of yellow smear across is the arc of deforestation. Deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon has been happening for decades, driven in the beginning largely by the desire to sort of consolidate and claim sovereignty over parts of the Amazon by the military government. And it sort of proceeded in the decades that followed through planned and ad hoc settlement and a sort of set of perverse incentives that ended up driving further and further deforestation north into the Amazon. And the boom-bust hypothesis has been around for just about as long, and it gets at the idea that in the Amazon, the deforestation is driven, more by wanting to have agricultural development rather than timber clearing. So it's got some characteristics of creating a renewable resource, but at the same time that the soils are really poor, land gets abandoned, so you also have sort of non-renewable resource characteristics. And the question is what we're doing in the Amazon going to lead us to sort of a typical non-renewable resource a boom followed by a bust where we kind of lose what's going on. So sort of testing the boom-bust hypothesis is about looking at whether the development activities that are happening in the Amazon are leading to long-term infrastructural development, or if the wealth is really just being dissipated. So there was an article about 2 years ago in Science that had some really strong evidence for there being a boom-bust cycle. And what the authors did, this is Rodriguez et al. In Science, they looked at the legal Amazon, and can you see the hand when I do that? Okay, good. And they classified all the municipalities in the Amazon into 7 classes based on the extent of current deforestation and the rate at which they were actively being deforested. And what they came up with was this map of the Amazon where you can see this is our arc of deforestation, and that's where our sort of mid to late frontier municipalities are. And they ended up having to exclude a lot. These are these things in black. But what they did is they looked at the rates or the levels of deforestation in those different classes, and they compared them against the municipal Human Development Index for the year 2000. And the Human Development Index is a sort of a composite index of life expectancy, standard of living, and literacy. And what they found was that it looked as though the Human Development Index, or the sort of the quality of life, was much higher in these, active frontier, actively deforesting sites, but was much lower in either of the tails. So in the pre-frontier and in the post-frontier. Now it didn't look like things were really translating into long-term development. One of the things about that study is that they used data for the year 2000. They used the Human Development Index, which comes from the population census, and they used deforestation data, which came available in 2000. But only looking at a single point in time is going to confound a number of different things. So in the work that we're currently doing, we want to see if we can get a different lens into the problem by looking at different time periods. The Brazilian Statistics Agency has a whole bunch of wonderful data publicly available at the municipal level. We can get the Human Development Index, which is derived from the population census for 1991 and 2000, and eventually we'll have it for 2010. It's not quite available yet. We also have an agricultural census available from 1996 and 2006, and then all of that wonderful deforestation data is available annually, and that looks at current levels of deforestation rates from 2000 up until, I guess, we'll have the 2010 data soon. So we want to see what we can get out of this that tells us a bit of a different story. So this is work that we're just kind of starting. We're at an early stage. The first thing that I set about doing was trying to, with the data that I downloaded, recreate the patterns or the classes that the Rodriguez paper showed. And so I did what they did in their paper. I looked at only municipalities that had more than 70% of their land originally in forest. I used the same sort of set of classes, and I don't spell them out here, but they're in the supplementary material to the paper. And I couldn't quite get the same set that they found. And it's one of those things where different people publish the same data that are a little bit different depending on what you want to say, and that's probably what's happening there. So I used a bit of a different classification. I was a little bit more generous about what I let be in my set. I included municipalities that had at least 30% of their land originally in forest. And I only looked at total levels of deforestation rather than tying in those 2 dimensions of deforestation and deforestation rate in my classification. And I have a slide a little bit later on that sort of shows how those 2 things relate. But what I did is I tried to look first at, okay, can I reproduce what they found? And here in these sort of box whisker plots, I get that. This first column, these are my unclassified sites, so you can ignore that first column. But here we kind of see that same sort of boom-bust, going from pre-frontier through the frontier to post-frontier. But what I then did is I said, okay, well, let's look at how the HDI is changing, the Human Development Index is changing from 1991 to 2000. And you see, you really don't get that picture at all. What you see is that, in fact, the areas of the frontier that have been developing the most in that period are the post-frontier. So it's not really the same story when you look over time. So we want to try and see, does that hold up from looking 2000 to 2010? Like I said, we don't have all the data yet. The population census data is kind of trickling out as it gets analyzed, but there are certain things we can look at. For instance, we can look at the rate. This shows the rate of the basic literacy rate, which is one of the components of the municipal HDI. And we get that same kind of picture. This is our unclassified municipalities, but then here, this is the sort of pre-frontier through to the post-frontier in 2010. We've got that same hump, but then when we look at the change from 2000 up to 2010, we see that the growth doesn't match that. So whatever this hump is, it kind of predates what we're looking at. And we see something a little bit more convincing of the boom bust here when we look at the income. We see our hump, and then it looks like we might have a bit of a hump there too in the period from 2000 to 2010, which would just be telling us that, you know, whatever is generating income is generating the most income here in these actively deforesting sites. So that tells us that there's some kind of a deforestation leading to income signal. But to me, so far, it isn't really a convincing sign that the boom bust hypothesis is really holding up. And so one of the other things that I've done is looking over this period from 2000 to 2009, where we have the deforestation data. I've plotted the total amount of deforestation in that 10-year period versus the final level of deforestation in 2009. And then the color of these dots is, here it's the percent change in income, and here it's the percent increase in the basic literacy rate. And what you can see is, yeah, I mean, the most change in deforestation is happening in these sort of middle municipalities that are in the mid-state of deforestation, but they aren't really where most of the growth is occurring. You can see that it's these municipalities in the pre-frontier and post-frontier tails that appear, at least here, to be experiencing the most growth. And I should note that this isn't corrected for inflation. I haven't dealt with that yet, but certainly there's enough here to show us, you know, there's more to the story than this simple boom-bust hypothesis. So we want to do a couple other things, and we're just kind of getting started. But we want to try and see, well, can we get a better lens into what's going on by looking through the sort of characteristics of the farming itself. So I've taken the 1996 agricultural census, and I've calculated a set of variables here that I think fairly well characterize or can be used to characterize the agricultural process. We have, at the municipal level, the average property size and the distribution of land in the form of a Gini index. We have the sort of relative importance of croplands versus livestock production. We have diversity in production. We have the use of so mechanized agriculture through the use of tractors. We have labor, and then we have the sort of the average land use. So that's about 11 or 12 variables. And what I just did here is a simple principal component analysis to see what are the dimensions that really matter. And in this particular instance, the first three principal components end up explaining about 60% of the variance in those 12 variables. And conveniently, they kind of map onto things that we would expect, really characteristic farming approaches. So I plotted them here. For those of you who grew up with video games or role-play games, you can think of these as strength and agility and these kind of things. But in this first column, our first principal component, we're looking at municipalities with some really big properties, but diversity, so a lot of small properties as well. Low intensity production, focus on cattle. We're really talking about big ranches, municipalities with big ranches. This other class, we're seeing some larger properties, but pretty evenly spread across. We're seeing a lot of intensive crop production. And so we're really talking about, it looks like this is sort of the dimension of intensive large family farming. And then in this last thing here, we're seeing somewhat larger farms, but what we're really seeing is not a lot of development, lots of forest. And so this is that sort of pre-frontier land speculation properties. So these three classes are kind of, it turns out that they're kind of convenient to think about what's going on in the frontier. When I plot these spatially, looking at that first principal component, so this is our big cattle, this is our intensive, big family farm, and this is land speculation. We see that, okay, here and this is the state of Mato Grosso. This is where there's a lot of soy and cattle. So that's kind of what we would expect to see. We see that these larger family farms are spread a little bit more over the Amazon, and then we see really in that pre-frontier area, that's where all the land speculation is going. So that's what we'd expect to see. What I then have done, just to get going, is I've plotted out that three-dimensional principal component space. And what's really kind of cool to see, and you don't necessarily need to be familiar with which these states are, but you can see each color here is a different state. And so you can see that what's going on in the state really, it clusters really tightly by the state. And in this first plot, where I'm plotting the first principal component against the second, so this is the sort of relative importance of the big cattle ranches versus these intensive family farms, we get this really interesting kind of split in the relationship. And I don't mean this literally in the sort of ecological sense of are we looking at competition versus mutualism, but what's really interesting is that in these poorer states here, we have one relationship between these two farm types where it looks like one is substituting for the other. Whereas in these sort of richer states over here that are sort of active and post-frontier, we see a very different relationship. And I don't know enough yet to know whether we're really looking at divergence and two different things going on, or whether we're looking at a trajectory of development that moves from here to here. What I really need to do is kind of connect this to the data in the 2006 agricultural census. And unfortunately, it's not a trivial thing to do, because the census has gotten much, much better and much more sophisticated in the 10 years. But unfortunately, the aggregate data that's made publicly available isn't aggregated in the same way as the 1996 data at the moment. So it's kind of really difficult. It's a non-trivial process to find a good way to compare those two. So that's kind of where I am with that. So this is new work that we're doing. It's kind of fun, and we're having fun with it. What we're doing is we're really waiting to get that 2010 data and see what's going on. We want to find a good way to compare what's going on in the ag census between 1996 and 2006. And we're also looking for some feedback about different ways to take this. So I guess questions wait for the end, but thanks very much.
So the next speaker is Sarah? Yes. Sorry?
So good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Sarah Kashula, and I'm a second-year EI Fellow, and I work on the monitoring and evaluation team for the Millennium Villages project. And today I thought I might spend some time talking to you about some of the implementation research I have been doing around the Agricultural Input Subsidy Program in the Millennium Villages project. But before I launch into the implementation research, I thought it's probably a good idea if I just give you a very brief background as to the Agricultural Input Subsidy Program in the Millennium Villages project. As many of you are probably aware, the Millennium Villages program is a multi-sectoral development project. It's active in 10 African countries, and the objective is to help the villages in which we work to reach the Millennium Development Goals by 2015. And within the agricultural sector, one of the major interventions that is promoted is the provision of subsidized inputs, which is technically fertilizer, chemical fertilizer, hybrid or improved seeds, and sometimes pesticide and fungicide to farmers. But the important thing to realize about this input subsidy program is that it's a staggered approach. So whereas in the beginning you have subsidies at about 90%, these are gradually phased out to a system where farmers are sufficiently linked with markets and or alternate credit facilities so that they can then self-finance the purchase of these inputs themselves in later years, usually by year 3 to 5 of the project. So because of this staged approach, not only has the MVP got something to say about the initial setup and delivery of these systems, but also the transitioning and sustainability. And from an implementation perspective, it's particularly interesting to study, particularly due to the political and historical Malawi, Nigeria, Zambia, Tanzania, Ghana, and later Kenya as well. So the donor community is still quite reticent about this move. They've acknowledged that there are some emerging best practices which might assist countries in avoiding what they term the mistakes of the past. But there really is the need for more rigorous implementation research in this area. Now, these issues are incredibly complex to research, but fortunately in the Millennium Villages project we have quite a rigorous monitoring and evaluation platform. As some of you will be aware, we have surveys or an impact evaluation component. There's also a performance evaluation component. There's a costing component. And what was missing until very, very recently was a process evaluation or implementation science component. And what I've been doing mainly as a postdoc since I joined the EI is working with a colleague, Win Hun, to set up an implementation research platform in the Millennium Villages. So the methods that, basically process evaluation is meant to complement a traditional impact evaluation, which of course asks the question, does it work? But the process of evaluation focused more on what was done and how and why were outcomes achieved. So although process evaluation or implementation research will integrate with quantitative elements of a monitoring and evaluation system, the primary method of data collection is actually qualitative, which was something that was missing from the M&E platform before. So the methods that we employed were mainly field-based. I've been doing a lot of field work and up till now, and this has been going on until just very recently when we finished our final process evaluation. So we've concluded between myself and my colleague, she has done 6 sites and I myself have done 6 sites, all visits to all 12 MPP research sites. And we generally spend 3 to 4 weeks in each site. And we do 1 to 3 hour in-depth interviews and focus groups with a variety of stakeholders, mostly project staff, but we also interview community and donors and partners in the area and key government players, usually at the local level. And then we can do a thematic content analysis, and we can highlight and code the content into an implementation theme that we might have established before we did the evaluation, or which is coming out of the data as we go along. And this was a very efficient way to organize this qualitative data in a very systematic way, especially since it spans so many sites and so many interventions. So while the qualitative data is really, the star of the show with the process evaluation, it should also be mentioned that we collected and collated and also rely upon a lot of supplementary data in this evaluation. For example, with respects to the input subsidy program, it's very useful to just get an assessment of the tons of fertilizer distributed in each site over the 4-year time frame of the project that was evaluated. And as you can see here, if you were to aggregate the kilograms over the households in the cluster, there's a huge variation in the amount of fertilizer distributed. Now, if we compare that to the costing data, which shows the expenditure on fertilizer, it can partly explain those trends, because you might see, as in the case of Mali, a strong government contribution, or you might see, as in the case also of Mali and Ghana and Ethiopia, a strong community contribution. So that's bolstering up the project's kind of standard budget. But while this sort of data is useful in kind of explaining, where the fertilizer came from, it does not explain why there is this variation between sites. And that's really where the process evaluation and the qualitative data and the content analysis really comes into its own. So in terms of the implementation themes that we've been analyzing, we've just really started looking into this. So this is a bit of a work in progress. But it seems like across the sites, there were 4 major strategies, or components, I should say, of a successful fertilizer subsidy program. Of course, you have to build your farmer capacity. At the same time, there was a need to build input distribution and input market development. At the same time, there was a need to build output market development, that is the products that were generated by the farmers themselves. And finally, systems for credit and transitioning. Now, every site had its own method for trying to reach these 4 goals. And that was really in the spirit of the Millennium Villages project, as a sort of a work in progress where people could try different things out. And so numerous strategies were tried across the sites. This is just some of them as they're coming out. Some of these strategies are, standard, very well documented in the development literature. Some of them are a little bit more innovative. They were a little bit more ad hoc. They were a little bit more organic. They were just tried out because they made sense in the context of the project at the time. So one of the first steps has just simply been to identify these strategies and then mark off in which country it occurred in. Now, I don't really have time to go into the nuances of these different strategies and what worked and how it was applied. But before I leave, I'd just like to highlight a few of the real implementation highlights that are coming out of this analysis to date. I think that in the field of input distribution and market development, an extremely interesting intervention that was tried out in a number of the sites has been the issue of wealth targeting. As I mentioned, in the first year of the project, all farmers got the same package. But as they transitioned out of the subsidy program and into a credit program, obviously the more vulnerable households tended to fall off. And what many of the sites actually did is they started working with community to do targeted input delivery programs specifically for the vulnerable. And this often interlinked into credit systems for the vulnerable, cooperatives for the vulnerable, and their own distribution systems, in fact. So just looking at how those wealth targeting methods sort of panned out and worked out in the site is extremely interesting. Another thing that has really been interesting to look at is the use of voucher systems. Fertilizer vouchers have been proposed as a method for encouraging healthy input market development by making sure that local distribution systems are not compromised when the market is flooded by free or subsidized inputs. So these vouchers may be implemented at a national level as part of a national fertilizer subsidy program, or they could even be just implemented by getting a local trader to be the one who provides, your project with the inputs through exchange of vouchers to project beneficiaries. And what's quite interesting is the project had examples of both these systems, a national one and a local one as well. So it's interesting to see how they developed in the sites and how they worked out. And then finally, in the area of output market development and credit and transitioning, this was a huge area, and we could talk a lot about these interventions at length, but 2 I would really like to highlight as particularly interesting are the role of warehouses. And our own analysis of the value to cost ratios on the yields got from some of the Millennium Villages plots has shown that value to cost ratios are really significantly higher about 6 to 8 months post-harvest. So it's really very important for farmers to have a safe storage option so that they can store their harvest and then sell it at a profitable rate. Otherwise, fertilizer application is less profitable, and in some cases, it's not profitable at all. So many of the sites recognized this and spent a lot of time investing in warehousing infrastructure with varying success and at various time frames. But what's especially interesting is that some of them took it a step further. And then once they had the warehouse functioning, they linked this into a credit and transitioning mechanism, where a farmer would effectively bank his commodity at the warehouse, be issued with a receipt, and use that as collateral for purchase of inputs for the next season. And then when he repaid the loan, he would have presumably made a profit because of the delay in sale, and it'd be adequate to repay both the loan, the interest, and also the cost of the warehousing. So this kind of model is certainly not new, and it's been utilized, even in the West and on a national scale in some African countries, but there's very little implementation research of its application with smallholder farmers. So it's very interesting to see how it played out. So those are just some of the highlights I'm going to be focusing on in the next few months. And just to summarize the way forward, input subsidy programs are increasingly popular in African countries, but the implementation research is lagging behind. So in the Millennium Villages project, we've completed our implementation research for our 12 sites. And for the way forward, we're looking forward to looking at how implementation lessons can inform future input subsidy programs, addressing what worked, what didn't, and why. So thank you.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to present some of my work here today. My name is Jamie Madrigano, and I am a first-year Earth Institute Fellow, and I'm affiliated with the Malman School of Public Health. So today I'm going to talk about the role of air quality, climate, and social stressors on human health. I'm going to start off by talking briefly about some of my dissertation work, and then just kind of an overview of what I plan to do while I'm here during my fellowship. So I'm an epidemiologist by training, and my work primarily focused on environmental factors and human health, and specifically on air pollution or particulate matter air pollution and its effects on human health. It's pretty well established that particulate matter is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease as well as respiratory disease. However, what is a little less clear at this point is mechanisms by which that occurs, and particularly for cardiovascular disease, and also who are the most susceptible populations. So those sorts of things, biologic plausibility as well as looking at vulnerable populations, are important in terms of policy making, and that was most of the focus of my prior research. I looked at, in a large cohort of individuals, the associations between increased air pollution exposure and biomarkers of disease. And specifically, we found that increased exposure to particulate matter was associated with increased levels of cellular adhesion molecules, which are markers of endothelial dysfunction, as well as being associated with changes in DNA methylation, which is an epigenetic mark, and that's increasingly being looked at as a way by which the broader environment may impact human health by changing the epigenome. And then lastly, I looked at, I did some work looking at the role of temperature and the onset of heart attack or myocardial infarction. And this was looking at a population living in the Worcester, Massachusetts metropolitan area, and using a case crossover design study. So with that, we were able to compare days on which a heart attack occurred for an individual to other days within the same month and same year, and try to determine if temperature was associated with the onset of the heart attack, while still controlling for other individual level factors that might confound that association. So in that study, we did not find an association between heat and heart attack onset in the entire population, but when we stratified by some different characteristics, and one which we looked at was a measure of socioeconomic position, that being, did the individuals live in a census tract that had more poverty or less poverty? We found that heat was associated, or there was a much higher rate of heart attack on extreme hot days in those individuals living in poorer areas. So this is kind of interesting and is in line with some of the work on temperature and morbidity and mortality, although there's still a lot to be determined there. So here at Columbia, I'd like to continue to work in these areas and try to look at both air quality and temperature in an integrated way, as well as continuing to look at vulnerability. So one thing with a changing climate, we expect that changes in temperature are going to impact human health. However, who is going to be most susceptible to these impacts is unclear. As I mentioned in the previous work I did, and there have been some studies that have tried to look at this, there's some evidence that socioeconomic position confers some increased vulnerability, as well as age and other chronic conditions. But there's still a research need to get a better handle on this. In fact, the U.S. National Institutes of Health recently highlighted this as a research priority to look at vulnerability to the health impacts of climate. And one vulnerable population that I'm specifically interested is inner city residents, because they often have higher exposure to air pollution due to various local sources, as well as higher exposure to heat due to the urban heat island effect. And so that leads to another question, which is how do these exposures interact, and is there synergism between them on the health impacts? So there's been some work in this area, so I'll highlight some of that, what's out there and where I think the gaps are, which I'm hoping to look at. There's been some studies that have looked at the synergism between air pollutants and climate measures like temperature. There's a couple of studies on looking at ozone and temperature, and in particular, one study was interesting because they found that there was a synergistic relationship between ozone and temperature on the effect of mortality in the northeastern United States, but not in the southeastern United States. So it's not clear. That could be because of either physiologic or behavioral adaptation, like air conditioning, prevalence, or other measures. But it is interesting, and could use some more attention. And there's also, as I mentioned, been differential temperature mortality relationships. But a lot of these studies are done at the city level, comparing characteristics of different types of cities. And so, as we know, a lot of the mitigation and adaptation efforts are being focused at a more local level. So I think, looking at that vulnerability within a metropolitan area or within a city is really important. And there's been a little bit of work in that area. This map is a map that basically looked at potential vulnerability measures that are kind of in the literature at this point, and mapped them in the New York City metropolitan area. This is a study by Reed and colleagues. And show that there is quite a bit, and created a heat vulnerability index, and then show that there's quite a bit of vulnerability within the metropolitan area. But one thing that they didn't do here is actually validate that those were really increasing susceptibility to the health impacts of temperature by relating this to health outcome data. So that's something that I would like to do here. So the questions I'm hoping to answer in my time here are: how do temperature and air pollution interact to impact health? What local socioeconomic and built environment characteristics modify these associations? And then another related, but not really within as similar as the first two, is how does the public's perception of health impacts influence their willingness to mitigate climate change? As for the first two projects, the first two questions, I'm starting or getting involved in a couple of epidemiology projects. The first is using county-level data on mortality in the New York metropolitan area to look at the synergism between temperature and ozone. And then the second is to really try and fill in the missing piece of from that map, and that would be to use New York City data, neighborhood-level data, to look at vulnerability to temperature with real health outcome data that we have here on hospitalizations and mortality. And then finally, I'm working to put together a proposal to work in the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis, MESA, an ancillary study to that, the lung study, which is based here at Columbia. That's a large cohort with a lot of good information on environmental exposures and clinical outcomes and data for a cohort of over 6,000 individuals from around the US. So I'm working to get involved in that. And finally, to answer the last question, this is an interdisciplinary project that I'm developing with another EI fellow. And it relates to something I've thought a little bit about as because I'm familiar with the health literature, and that is kind of wondering if the public has knowledge of the real immediate health benefits of climate change mitigation, and if they, if knowing of those benefits would sort of change attitudes and minds about willingness to take measures to mitigate climate change. And so just briefly, I know there's another fellow who's going to talk a lot more about co-benefits, but I'm just going to briefly state that we know that some of the same sources or processes, like fossil fuel combustion, emit both greenhouse gases as well as health-damaging pollutants, like the ones that I've studied, particulate matter and ozone. And so actions that, try to mitigate climate change and reduce those greenhouse gases a lot of times also have an ancillary benefit of reducing those health-damaging pollutants. That's usually termed a co-benefit. And this has been in the literature a lot. This is from a paper back in 2001, just kind of imagining or putting some scenarios together of greenhouse gas mitigation measures and showing the real health impacts that would occur due to that ancillary reduction in particulate matter and ozone across 4 cities. But it's not clear to me from taking a little bit of a look at the perceptions literature and talking to some other people that this has really been looked at in terms of is the public aware of this, and how does this impact their willingness to take action on climate change. So we're working on a study to try and understand that. So finally, I just want to thank and acknowledge the people I've begun to work with and plan to continue working with over the next couple of years. That's Pat Kinney and Darby Jack in the Department of Environmental Health Sciences at the School of Public Health. I'm primarily working with them on the New York metropolitan area data. Graham Barr and Gina Lavasi, who are in the epidemiology department at the School of Public Health, and I'm working with them to get involved in the MESA cohort. And then Nana Petrovic, who is also a first-year fellow, and she's affiliated at the Center for Research on Environmental Decisions, and she and I are working to develop the survey on public perception of climate change mitigation from a health framework with feedback from other CRED investigators. Thank you.
I think I'm loud enough, so probably don't need the mic. So my name is Tian Ming Li. Most people just call me Ming. Yeah. So I am a first-year Earth Fellow, and this is my first week in New York City, and I got my first parking ticket today. Double parking, yeah. Huh? That's illegal. I was 5 minutes late, but yeah. Anyway, so today I'm going to talk about, for the first half of my talk, I'm going to talk about what I did for my PhD, which I recently defended about 3 weeks ago. And then it will kind of lead on to what I plan to do at the Earth Institute for the next 2 years. So I'm actually affiliated with E3B, the CRED, and the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication over at the School of Forestry School. title of the talk is Dimensions of Biodiversity Conservation Under Global Change, focusing on protected areas, which is my PhD topic, and human attitudes, which is what I plan to do. So everybody in this audience is probably just familiar with the global change impacts that we are set to have. And back in 2001, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was set up at the request of the United Nations. Thank you. At the request of the United Nations, actually Kofi Annan, the idea was actually to do a broad assessment on how human actually has impacted our ecosystems. So across the global ecosystem, what we find, and I'm focusing here only on land use and climate change impacts, we find that in the last century, so the color here, the darker color, represent the impact, highest impact for the past century, and the lighter color here represent low impact. And the arrow here represent what's going to happen this century. And what we find is that in the last century, we have high impact, very high impact in certain ecosystems, especially tropical forests, temperate grassland, inland water habitats. What will happen with climate change? So the past hasn't been very much of an very much impact in the ecosystem, but what is going to happen in this century is that everything seems to be on a rapid increase in terms of impacts. So the results came out in 2005, and that's roughly when I started my PhD. So that was an easy thing to do, essentially just jump on, the need to essentially look at the consequences of the global change impacts on ecosystem globally. So what I'm primarily interested, and here today I'm going to just talk about one chapter of my thesis here, which is essentially looking at the consequences of global change, particularly land use and climate change, its impacts on how we are protecting biodiversity. So in particular, we are focusing on the extent of our protected area or the global reserve system. So what I'm interested in is, are we actually protecting biodiversity in the right areas? And where exactly are the future conservation battlegrounds as we experience global climate and land use changes? So just to briefly talk about the different scenarios that came out from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, essentially 4 scenarios here representing 4 quite different trajectories along the development and the environmental protection or management axis. And so the idea is to provide 4 different scenarios for the policymaker so that they can more or less know what the consequences are. From the results of this land use climate change modeling led by the Netherlands Environmental Agency, what they came up with, they generated data that essentially gives us the projected global change impacts globally. And this is a map of the projected change impacts, and in turquoise or light green here, or blue, it's the impacts on climate change, and in red is impacts on land use change. So basically, the way we define climate change impacts on a particular grid cell here globally is when you have a change from one natural land cover type, say from the temperate forest, say from tundra to temperate forest, so you get a climate change impact. Whereas for land use change impacts, when you get a modification from a natural land cover, say the tropical forest, to agriculture or a modified land cover type, then it's considered being impacted by land use. So in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, the 4 scenarios provided 4 different sets of projections. And this is just illustration from the scenario adapting mosaic. So the details of the scenarios are not that important in this, in my talk. I did just to show you some of the data. So, so what I'm really interested to see whether our current protection, our current reserve networks, our current conservation prioritization or planning, whether it will be useful into the future with projection of the different changes. So what we can see here is that if we were to just look at bioregions here defined by, say, an example of bioregion here would be a biogeographic region or a tropical rainforest in Africa, for instance. And we have about approximately 60 of them. And what we can see here is that in general, if you looked at the projected land cover change due to climate change and due to land use change, and you map them, and you relate them, the past and the future or the projected, you do not find much association here. So essentially, if there was a good correspondence, it would have been like a one-to-one line here, which means that the current protection or the current conservation planning would have been sufficient. Yeah? But this is not the case if we looked at bioregions. And if we were to look at nations, that means we were to analyze the data at national level, we also do not see any trend. So it's essentially a flat line, a horizontal line here. So what we see is that projected land cover change is very different from the past land cover changes. And if we actually map the impact, or what I call the conservation risk index, which is essentially the ratio transformed to protected area, the higher the index, the more risk a bioregion or a nation is subjected to. We find that, so this is based on the past land use, which is set at year 2000. The lighter the color, the lower the risk. The redder the color, or the hotter the color, the higher the risk. So we find that if you were to compare the two maps here, one with the past and the other in the future, you see very different outlook. So in the future, in particular, we get a strong red, high-risk area in Africa. And if you just looked at the climate change conservation risk index, you see that it's actually much higher, and rightly so, in the higher latitudinal countries. And together, if you were to combine the future land use and the conservation risk index, with a measure of conservation value here quantified by the number of threatened vertebrates, here represented by the amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. So the number of threatened species, threatened vertebrates in each country, we came up with a matrix called the conservation need. And the idea is to relate the conservation need here with governance, quality, and GDP, which are key attributes of a country. And what we find is that in general, the weaker countries tend to have high conservation need, highest conservation need, and obviously the poorer country also has very high conservation need. So if we were to look at the big picture, what you see is that we are expecting a big shift in the projected impacts in the future, and this needs to be considered when we cite our reserves, where we cite our reserves, how we protect our biodiversity. And more importantly, with the different risks that we see in the rich versus the poor country, it highlights the need to actually have a very strong north-south, rich-poor transfer of conservation resources to actually make global biodiversity conservation more effective. So, what really led me to the project that I'm really interested or developing right now at the Earth Institute is that over the years, we haven't, with all the assessment and all the studies that we made, we still are witnessing a decline in biodiversity and ecosystems. So there has to be another reason. There has to be better ways to actually resolve this issue. So I thought about the way to do it is essentially looking at, going from a more social science angle, more social direction, which is to address the issues that we as humans are creating to the ecosystem and to the planet. So for my project at EI, I'm really interested in trying to get at underlying social factors and drivers of global change. What actually drives all those changes that we see. This is going to be carried out in collaboration with Ruth DeFries over at E3B and Tony Letzoritz over at Yale and affiliate of CRED. So the idea is to try to figure out how our actions, our behavior relate to what happens in the nature. So this was what I have been focusing for my past research, essentially looking at environmental impact on biodiversity. What I really need to do is to actually look at the different social mechanism and how it actually translates from individual actions to a more broader, higher level kind of interaction, and then how that actually interacts with nature, and then of course taking into account all the various feedback loops that one can see in this conceptual figure. So then the overarching question here is actually to understand the structure and implications of local, national, and global attitudes and behaviors on biodiversity conservation, climate change, environment, and sustainable development. And ideally, we want to be able to track all these changes across space and time. And we do have cross-sectional, cross-national data to test all these questions, or to at least have some idea of what's going on in the field. The other thing I'm particularly interested in is to look at the influence of the consumers, the affluent consumers in emerging Asian economies such as China and India. So I'm going to just briefly touch on the data sets that we have access right now. And one of them, which is really exciting right now, is we have full access to Gallup World Poll data. So questions that you see, if you actually are interested in Gallup World Poll, if you know Gallup World Poll, it's actually an organization that polls not just the country, US, but also globally. And it's a very respectable organization, and it has very good methodology and stuff. And they have been collecting lots of data on attitudes, worldviews, environmental attitudes, not just in US, but across the globe. So one example here is that in a cross-sectional data survey with, they found that the Indian population essentially are not really aware of global warming or climate change. And if you were to contrast that to some other countries that they have in the database, you find that it is indeed quite worrying, the trend. So with this data set, one could actually look at the different cross-cultural and even cross-national impacts or effects. And the other possible data sources, again sponsored by the Gallup poll, is to look at, in this case, at the regional scale, the attitudes of Europeans towards the issue of biodiversity. So again, really good data on the European countries. So in this particular report, the response here is actually, they were interested to see if people looked at, or Europeans in particular, looked at biodiversity loss as a serious problem. And they do, essentially. But then there's a need to actually expand this research and to see how, if there's any variation in terms of views across the globe. So just to briefly acknowledge my PhD advisor, who kind of pushed me to do global change research, and then acknowledge my a very close friend, colleague of mine, Navjot Sodhi, who recently passed, but has more or less motivated me in doing research in this field, looking at both the natural and the social angles of problems, global conservation problems in particular, my funding and the program, and then my advisors, and last but not least, the Gallup World Poll, Gallup organization. Thank you.